Hello Bertrand.
Hi, Geoffroy.
In this module, we will try to understand the use and the limits of the species approach as a tool for conservation, specifically in protected areas.
We know that biodiversity conservation is carried out by conserving genes, species, and ecosystems. Species is the basic unit of classification that groups living creatures sharing the same morphological, anatomical, physiological, biochemical, and genetic characteristics.
We will come back on this in detail in the next sequence.
A species is a group of living creatures that can interbreed and that will have a fertile offspring. It is usually connected to one or several habitats. In the field of genetics, species are differentiated so that the intraspecific genetic variation is much lower than the interspecific variation.
A species approach to conservation is based on the identification of pressures faced by a species locally or globally, on preparation of actions to help solving these pressures, and finally, on implementation of these actions.
Therefore, conservation efforts depend directly on the considered species status. This requires knowledge of its needs, namely in terms of habitat.
The species approach is complementary to other conservation approaches. It can be carried out ex situ or in situ, and sometimes combine both these aspects.
Ex situ conservation is done outside the species' original habitat, for example in zoos, botanical gardens, aquariums, or gene banks. It is used as a last resort when it is impossible to preserve an ecosystem or habitat.
The reproduction of captive species is one of its components and often concerns critically endangered species with small numbers and a fragmented or reduced habitat. Ex situ conservation can lead to the recovery of the population and its possible reintroduction.
In situ conservation is based on the conservation of the habitat, particularly thanks to protected areas, and the conservation of viable species populations within their natural habitat.
Indeed, the conservation of ecosystem aims at maintaining living organisms, their habitat, and the relationship between these organisms and their environment.
In situ conservation is preferred over ex situ conservation because of the larger geographic range it encompasses, which allows for the protection of many biological processes.
It is also more viable because natural selection and the evolution of species communities subsist in that context, and new communities, processes, and genetic materials are produced.
Of course, in situ conservation presents some risks. For instance, uncertainty in terms of population dynamics due to events influencing the survival or reproduction of individuals.
And also environmental uncertainty related to climate change, food availability, and the emergence of competition or predation, of parasites, diseases, and so on.
Natural disasters, floods, fires, and droughts are also a threat, just like genetic drift, consanguinity, and so on.
On the other hand, ex situ conservation complements rehabilitation and restoration of degraded ecosystems and the recovery of endangered species.
It is, however, important to maintain a big enough population in captivity in order to prevent genetic erosion and to be able to reintroduce animals into their native habitat.
The use of both in situ and ex situ conservation for the same species is hence feasible and sometimes preferred.
Conservation must take into account the habitat of the considered species. Indeed, a key factor of biodiversity loss is the modification of the habitat by man for different uses.
Due to this, the protection of habitat is considered a prerequisite for the survival of the species.
It is therefore key to identify and map essential habitats and preserve them, for example by rendering protected areas effective.
Indeed, and as we saw in the MOOC on protected area management, conservation is often based on protected areas. A good PA network is made of different PA categories so that it can properly protect the biodiversity components as well as the interactions and the related ecosystem services.
Another key notion of the species approach is the idea of umbrella species. When the habitat is preserved to answer the needs of an umbrella species, it contributes to preserving the habitat for many other species. Therefore, a primary species serves as an umbrella to others. Large species with vast living spaces, such as the large predators, are good umbrella species.
Likewise, by protecting sufficiently large species to maintain a viable population of a large species that requires vast open spaces, enough habitat is conserved to ensure the survival of many other species in the same habitat.
An endangered species, like we will see in the next module, is a species in danger of extinction in part or in the entire area of distribution. The protection of an endangered species can also contribute to the conservation of other species and the habitat through the umbrella effect.
All these important notions will enable managers to focus on a small number of species to protect larger communities.
The species approach also has benefits for communication when the species is important to the public or to the economy, allowing to reach a large public that will support the conservation effort.
Another benefit is that often this approach has easily accessible objectives focusing on a small number of individuals or their distribution that will allow a simple assessment of the success of the conservation work.
The species approach also has limits, mostly because it doesn't recognize ecosystem functions for biodiversity and it does not value the general goods and services provided by nature as it should.
It can be too targeted on one site without considering the interrelations with other sites and not take into consideration cultural, economic, and social factors in the conservation action.
Finally, it doesn't generate effective coordination with other areas of interest, such as farming, the environment, the forest industry, fisheries, health, and so on.
In conclusion, the species approach focusing on specific component of biodiversity cannot, by itself, be a complete conservation strategy.
Maintaining viable and self-sufficient wild populations in the natural environment must then remain the ultimate goal of conservation.